Hi, this is John Romano. I'm recording this lecture, a brief lecture about Incan Civilization for my course on World Civilization to 1500. The Incan Empire is the one large body that we're going to see in South America in this course. The only government we're really looking to in South America. But it is really, in some ways, a huge empire that will develop in South America in the mid-15th century. Previously, this area had a small series of regional states that would clash with one another frequently. But after a series of military campaigns, the Inca will then vastly expand their authority, and altogether building an empire that would stretch 2,500 miles and really make up a good part of the western coast of South America. And altogether it would make up around 11.5 million people. This made it at its height one of the largest states in the world. You'll notice just by looking at this map that the coastlands tended to be the lion's share of this empire, and to some degree some highlands, but not really territory in the Amazon rainforest, which likely would have been much more difficult to conquer. The term itself, Inca, initially referred in their own civilization to the rulers of this empire. In modern scholarly usage, however, Inca gets a far more expanded meaning. It really is meant to apply to people who were either rulers or subjects of the Inca Empire. And this here is the first European image of an Inca person. The Inca itself ruled as the military and administrative elite in these territories. They would lead armies that were composed of conquered people, who then in turn would conquer new people and incorporate them into their empire. The Incas were also known to be great lovers of bureaucracy, and they really paid careful mind to administration. One of the reasons why they were able to encourage obedience among the many subject peoples that they took in war was that they would take hostages from the ruling classes of anywhere that they conquered. Then they would force these hostages to live with them in their capital, with the threat, of course, that they could be killed if the subject peoples in that area chose to revolt. And we know that there was a large class of administrations of officials who served the Inca and who were hierarchically organized. A version of the standard language that was used in the Inca Empire, Quechua, was essentially their language of administration. And it actually is still spoken as a minority language in Peru today. One of the very interesting tools that at least gives us some insight into this great love administration is this thing here known as a quipu, spelled Q-U-I-P-U. A quipu may just look to you as if it were a necklace, but instead this really is a clever tool, a mnemonic aid to help people keep track of information, and likely some of these administrators who serve the Inca Empire. So how do they encode information in something that looks like a necklace? Well, within these strands, what you would see is all of different sizes of these strands, meaning that a size could give you information, where you chose to put knots, different colors, All of this, we think, could be used actually to save information. And we think that initially these were used to be able to, for instance, to keep statistics about population in different areas of the empire, who held certain property, taxes, what labor services were owed to the central government, even in some cases, historical data. So we think altogether that they helped with orderly government. It is unfortunate that in later times, many of these tools were actually destroyed by some of the European invaders, and we actually only have a very small number of them left. And it is something of a mystery to us today, the exact method by which information was put in them. And in fact, some researchers had so much difficulty trying to find consistent patterns across the different examples that we have, that some people think that there was no standard way to use these, that in fact, depending upon the user, it could be somewhat idiosyncratic about how they encoded information in them, which would, if that were true, would make it impossible really for us to figure out. The Incas referred to the territory that they owned as the land of the four quarters, and this land would find its capital city at Cusco, which was seen as the intersection of these four different divisions of territory that were ruled. Initially, we think Cusco was a city that was, first of all, the center by far of this empire, but also a very important administrative and religious area for the Inca. It was also a city of splendor, and we really are told by some of the descriptions at the time that there was a huge plaza at the center of the city that would have been filled with glistening white sand taken from Pacific beaches. And on top of that, there were huge temples dedicated, one to the sun, another to the moon, that would have been ornamented with gold and silver, with gems. And altogether, the sand and the precious metals would have shone in the sun, so it really would have been a dramatic scene. Supposedly, the city of Cusco, though you can't really see it here, was said to resemble the shape of a puma. The population of the city of Cusco was over 100,000 altogether, and really some of the movers and shakers of the Inca would live here. The rulers, the nobility, priests. And we think that in addition to the frequent use of precious metal, there would be red stone in many of the buildings. Fanning out from Cusco and connecting up the rest of the empire was an excellent road system that was created by the Inca. And the reason for its creation was simple in a certain way. First of all, it allowed the Inca to be able to deploy their military to be able to respond to any problems, any rebellions. It also, more broadly, when they were more settled, allowed the Inca to communicate around their empire. And you can see here, again, certain portions of this road system actually still exist. The road system was built altogether more than around 14,000 miles of road, and it included things like rope bridges that would have spanned over gorges and rivers. And you can see here many places, in most places, it would have been paved with stone. And in some places, believe it or not, it actually was even, the areas were chosen because seemingly they were shaded by trees. Not having horses to be able to get messages from one area of this empire to the next, they appeared to often use relay runners, who then could take messages and really passing on the message from one runner to the next. And of course, these messages could get both from or to Cusco as necessary. And we do think that having this kind of spine to the empire facilitated the spread of the language Quechua and also the religion of the ruling people. The Inca as a whole believed that their ruler was descended from the sun, and just as the sun shone on all things, and so too did all that was touched by the sun was also owned by the ruler. It is very difficult to say what the real origins were of this form of government ruled over by the Inca, or just generally the origins of the Inca, inasmuch as there was no writing in this culture. We often will really need to fall back upon the records that were left by the Spanish when they conquered this region. And at least some of the stories that the Spanish who spoke with the Inca of the time cobbled together about their life previous to the Spanish coming. According to the Inca themselves, it appears that only in the wake of a revolt of other South American people, which nearly destroyed Cusco, would the Inca then go on and start fighting against others in South America. In essence, this is really probably something of a self-serving propagandistic piece to say that they really, in some noble way, they were only trying to stop violence, crush revolts, and then they almost accidentally ended up creating their empire. To some degree, we think now archaeology can add a little bit to our picture here and give at least some idea of how the Inca came to be. I mean, it's clear even from some of these stories that we have that, for instance, that there really seems to be a clash with the physical evidence as to when the Inca begin their imperial expansion, which is really earlier than we had anticipated, just based upon stories. Normally, at least one ruler that was essential to this process of empire building is pictured here, a ruler known as Pachacuti, who was known as a warrior emperor. His name literally means earth shaker, which really, to some degree, just addresses the fact that he was known to be a fierce general and warrior. But also, there is a story told of him that at one point, just by words alone, he was able to cause stones to stand up and to help him combat against his enemies. Perhaps more than any of the other emperors, we know that this king was known for long, brutal attacks, both to the north and to the south of Cusco. And really using methods that would be fairly effective, if also fairly brutal. For instance, in the middle of a very hot sort of season of campaigning, he cut off the water supply to one tribe, which in essence forced them to give up. We also see Pachacuti was the first ruler to institute regular taxes among the Inca and forced people to begin to do labor for the government and to do things, for instance, like beginning to build roads. So already thinking about how to rule this empire. Interestingly enough, among the Inca, there was a strange instability at the top when it came to who was chosen as an emperor. So unlike in many places we've seen in which the son would simply inherit the position of an emperor from a father, really, the attitude among the Inca that was that any male member of the royal family could potentially become the emperor. And at least in a theoretical level, they would choose the person who was most capable to be able to do it. And this, in and of itself, probably caused a lot of infighting among the royal family. And it also meant that the theoretical person who could become king at any given time, the number was high because in many cases, emperors would take lots of wives, so they'd have plenty of legitimate children running around. We think that in addition to the emperors, both an aristocratic class and a priestly class existed, and both of them lived fairly privileged lives, eating fine foods, for instance, dressing in embroidered clothing. And they would wear in their ears these kind of large ear spools, which ended really distending the lobes of their ears, like modern day gauges, for instance, which caused some of the Spaniards later on to refer to them as big ears, which is not terribly nice. We also see in that there is this priestly class would lead ascetic and celibate lives, and would be required to do education, to do rituals. And we think for some of the major temples, there would be as many as 1,000 priests involved. As with all the civilizations we've seen before, the vast majority of the people in the Inca Empire were peasants, were cultivators who lived on the land, and who lived in small communities. And in addition to their own farming, they were required to do work on the land of aristocrats as well. And again, to give you some idea of just how much central planning there is among the Inca, the government would make sure that a surplus of agriculture that was not needed for day-to-day consumption would go into storehouses to feed the army, to feed workers, or just to save for public relief. And we do know, too, that peasants had owned some of their own land. Among their other duties, peasants would be required to do labor for the government, known as mita. And really, locals would be required to work for the state on a regular basis, receiving, for instance, an exchange for that supposedly a form of ritual entertainment. The service that one could fulfill was different. Some men served in the army. As I mentioned before, some people helped to build roads. Others helped to build buildings and cities. And we see sometimes that that part of there's a lot of planning when it came to where individual people would live within their empire too. And we really see that the Incas, sometimes they saw an area that was agriculturally rich, but that was not being tended to, and they would move people into a region to be able to take advantage of that. The other possibility is that in some cases we think if the Inca had suspicion that some people might be rebellious, they would move them to a new region of their empire to forestall the possibility of their revolting. Some people also served the government, the Inca government, in full-time service. Among the most interesting of these is a group of women known as the Cunha. These were women who lived privileged, but at least theoretically celibate lives in cities and towns around the empire. And I say theoretically because we know at times the Cunha would actually be given in marriage by Incan rulers to cement alliances with neighboring peoples, so of course ending their celibacy. The Cunha were dedicated to the sun. Sometimes they're referred to then as virgins of the sun. We know that the Mamacuna had an economic role. They did weaving, which was really an important form of wealth in the Inca Empire. And at least some of the patterns that they wove would be a sign of status. So only certain people could wear certain patterns. We also knew that the Mamacuna brewed a form of corn beer for Incan nobles. And this beer would be consumed at state religious festivals. Among other government servants, one might note, there were full-time men who tended royal llamas, who could be a source of meat. Among the Inca, we do not think that there's any real merchant class. There certainly was a good deal of bartering for surplus agriculture, certain handcrafted goods at the local level. But long distance trade was really something that, in as much as it was done at all, was something that the central government engaged in. So there was no private exchanges, but occasionally if the government needed certain artisan goods or certain agriculture that couldn't grow itself, it would indeed trade with neighboring peoples, those who had not been conquered. One of the things that struck many of the Spanish invaders, but maybe still strikes us today, about the Incan people was that they were serious about their religion. And this is, for instance, an Incan mummy who rather ghoulishly was taken back to Europe to display. You can see still today it's out in display. Part of this connection to religion was that the Inca had a profound relationship to their own ancestors. And really, even after death, it was thought that it was important to mummify their remains, if only through natural means. If you went to a high enough point, sometimes people could be mummified naturally. These dead ancestors could then serve in the role of intermediaries with the gods. And as a result of this, you wanted to take good care of your dead ancestors, giving them jewelry, food and drink. In some cases, even bringing them out to show to people on important occasions. It was really thought as a whole that this kind of goods that you would give to the dead was something that was owned communally then. It was not really owned just by one person. Altogether, we see, in addition to this interesting sort of connection to dead ancestors, we also see the Inca invest a lot of energy into the worship of nature, especially the sun god, but also other forces of nature, like, for instance, the moon, the stars, other planets, the rain. All of these things were seen to be as forces of the divine. Some Inca in particular, including the ruler Pachacuti, showed a special favor to the god Firacocha, pictured here, who was seen as the creator of the world and all that was in it, both the physical world and humans in it. As for the emperor, he was seen as descended from the sun. He was seen as a god king. And his power, as a result of that, was normally seen to be absolute, and he could not make mistakes. I mentioned you earlier, theoretically at least, he owned all that was in the empire. This is Machu Picchu, one of the famous Inca sites, although it's a little unclear exactly how this site was used. The Inca do ritual like sacrifice, although you'll be happy to note that normally sacrifices were of a fairly simple nature. For instance, a form of sacrifice of agricultural produce. Occasionally, also, they would sacrifice animals like llamas. It was really only on very rare occasions of great stress in which children would be sacrificed. So there was some human sacrifice, although not much. Finally, it was very interesting, especially to some of the Spaniards who came in contact with the Inca, that there really was a strong moral dimension to Incan beliefs. And they had something that really looked a whole lot like Christian sin, and something that, again, this sort of wrongdoing that was seen as a violation of the established social or natural order. In connection with this, too, the Inca believed that there was a form of life after death in which one could receive rewards or punishments. It was felt that sin could bring disaster both to one individual or also to the community as a whole. And so, as a result of this, there's a form of confession and penance from Incan priests, which would bring people back into the good graces of the gods. And again, without much imagination, you can see just how much many of these beliefs mapped on very strongly with Catholic beliefs that Spaniards already held. So they felt that it would be easier, in essence, to displace the native religion with Catholicism. All right, thanks for your attention. Bye-bye.